normal year.
Tragedy at the pole. Don't go there. You'll die. Don't go near the poles. Don't go there.
In November of 1910, Robert Scott arrived in the Antarctic aboard the ship Terra Nova. He established his base camp in a hut at Cape Evans, and on November 1st, 1911, after a year of preparation, he set off for the pole. 2 weeks later, Scott and his party of 16 men, 10 ponies and 22 dogs arrived at a location 150 miles inland. They called the site One Ton Depot because earlier in the year, members of the expedition had journeyed there to leave over a ton of supplies. 1 ton was to be the springboard for their assault on the pole and a safety valve for their return.
So from here on, I guess I would assume you've had enough of me talking, so I'm going to let you enjoy the rest of the documentary, remembering as you're watching the whole time that none of what they're saying about the Antarctic can be taken as truth. We know that it's a giant ring around us. I'll just give you another shot of that before I part, and I'll let you watch the rest of the documentary in peace. But remember that while you're watching it, try and remember that it's the ring around you. And watch the shots that they give you and listen clearly to what they're saying. And you can piece together more of what's really there. And take anything this NASA chick with the purple muumuu on says. Take anything she says with a grain of salt. Alright, I'm out for now. Obviously, what this is alluding to and showing is that there's a lot more going on at the North Pole and at the South Pole than what they would have us believe. Alright, Flatwater out. I'll talk to you guys soon. Ciao.
Despite all their planning and stockpiling of provisions, the odds were against them making it to the pole. Scott himself had failed in an attempt 8 years earlier, as had Shackleton in 1909. The continent of Antarctica is larger than India and China combined, and from Scott's hut at Cape Evans, the trek to the pole was more than 900 miles. The first part of the journey would take them 400 miles across the featureless Ross ice shelf. Then they would have to climb the 125-mile-long Beardmore Glacier. Finally, at an altitude of 10,000 feet, the team would face the final 370-mile slog to the pole itself. If they made it, they would then have to retrace their steps back to the safety of the hut. Scott's expedition was financed by the Royal Geographical Society, which expected him not only to reach the pole, but also to oversee rigorous scientific research while he was there.
Scott was tremendously interested in science. I mean, not only was he proud of the fact that he was leading the biggest scientific expeditions that had ever gone down south, it was much deeper than that. He derived enormous intellectual satisfaction from the scientific work which was being done by his team. He was hugely curious about it.
Scott was the leader of a well-financed and highly publicized Antarctic expedition. He was equipped with the very best technology available, and he had surrounded himself with the most accomplished scientists he could find. Herbert Ponting, the team's official photographer, made a film documenting the expedition and the scientific work being done.
Outside the hut, Lieutenant Evans would spend hours with his telescope, making astronomical observations. An intensely cold job, which demanded stoical quality.
Among others, the presence of meteorologist George Simpson was featured on the film.
Inside the hut, that meteorologist Dr. Simpson had a vast collection of scientific instruments for studying weather conditions. Surgeon Atkinson did research work with his microscope.
Simpson, nicknamed Sonny Jim, became indispensable to Scott. He was responsible for recording and analyzing the Antarctic weather, and Scott respected him immensely. The feeling was mutual.
Simpson said that he had never met anyone who had the scientific spirit so utterly unalloyed. All of the scientists particularly admired him. They all talked about him as being someone who could get to the nub of any scientific question immediately.
But later critics of Scott claimed he had made irrational decisions. These claims did not sit well with Solomon, who discovered much evidence to the contrary. Wherever she looked, she found signs that Scott had been a meticulous planner. The scientific method seemed to be at the heart of his preparations.
Captain Scott used to spend a lot of his time in his little den writing up his journal and working out plans for the journey to the pole, for every detail had to be carefully thought out beforehand.
Scott devised a careful plan. Knowing that it would be impossible for the men to carry all their supplies with them, he had ordered a series of earlier journeys into the interior to stockpile provisions along the route. For transport across the ice shelf, Scott chose ponies, because Shackleton had had success with them 2 years earlier. Dogs and motorized tractors would provide minimal backup support, and the ponies would be slaughtered en route to provide food. Once at the Beardmore Glacier, the men would hold their own supplies. This would be grueling on the outbound trek, but Scott was counting on light loads and a strong tailwind to drive them back to the depots on the return. Each leg of the journey had its own carefully thought-out team. A party of 16 would set out from base camp to help carry provisions. At the glacier, half the men in the 2 dog teams would turn back, while the other 8 men continued on. When they reached the plateau, Scott would select 3 men to accompany him on the final leg. Timing would be crucial. In order to beat the onset of winter, the team had to be back at Cape Evans by the end of March. Scott had thought through every detail. How many units of food the men would need per day, how many miles they would have to average on the polar plateau and on the ice shelf. For Solomon, there was nothing sloppy about Scott's preparation.
I think Scott tried to plan the journey to the pole very much as a scientist and as an engineer, in a sense. He tried to figure out what it would take and how he would do it. That's very much, I think, the modern way. It's, in a sense, he was a man ahead of his time.
As they approached the top of the Beardmore Glacier, the excitement began to grow. They were nearing the end of the second leg, and it was almost time for Scott to pick his final team for the actual assault on the pole. It had been 40 days since they left One Ton Depot, and the going had been difficult. A blizzard had delayed them near the base of the glacier, and the ponies had struggled through the heavy snow. But Scott had pressed them to make up time, and they were now back on track. The team had finished with the ponies and was now relying on man-hauling. Each 800-pound sledge was pulled by a team of 4 men. In addition to his race against winter, Scott had another reason to push the pace. On the way to Antarctica, he had found out that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who had lost his bid to become the first to the North Pole, was now trying to beat Scott to the south.
Scott realised that actually it was going to be a race between the 2 of them and that Amundsen could very well get there before him. But at the same time, he tried to push that out of his mind because he was, I think, just as interested for much of the time about the scientific achievement that he hoped would come from his expedition, the work that his team that he was taking down there was going to do.
Above the Beardmore, Scott was feeling confident. At the last minute, he decided on a polar party of 5, instead of the 4 he had originally intended. Perhaps he wanted to reward as many as possible for the hard work they had done to reach that point. Scott's critics regard this change as a crucial mistake. But Solomon is convinced that while it may have led to discomfort, it was not a big enough gaffe to derail the expedition.
The problem with having 5 men had in part to do with the fact that it took longer to cook for 5 than 4. Scott confessed that. It was a big problem. It took a half an hour more. The tent was really too small for 5 men. Somebody would get kind of pushed off the floor cloth onto the edge of the tent. That's obviously not a good situation. So for many reasons, having 5 instead of 4 was a mistake, but I don't think it would have been a fatal one.
Finally, on the Antarctic plateau, the men continued to trudge southward. Their spirits were high, but they were beginning to grow tired after nearly 60 days of marching, dragging their sledges behind them. On January 9th, they passed the southernmost point reached by Shackleton in 1909. They were now walking on virgin ground. Scott was still confident.
It is wonderful that 2 long marches would land us at the pole. We left our depot today with 9 days' provisions, so that it ought to be a certain thing now.
Scott had good reason to anticipate success. His team was making excellent progress, and he was impressed with the men he had chosen for the final push. Edmund Wilson, the expedition's chief scientist, was a doctor and a talented artist, and Scott's best friend. Henry Bowers, nicknamed Birdie for his prominent nose, was known for his exceptional stamina. Lawrence Oates, the aristocratic but unassuming army captain, had been in charge of the ponies on the expedition. And seaman Edgar Evans. He was the strong man of the group. By the middle of January, the men had covered nearly 900 miles. They had climbed 10,000 feet up a glacier strewn with crevasses, and they had survived on rations of dried meat and lard. Now, they were approaching their final destination. On January 17, 1912, the team reached the pole. But the glory that Scott had dreamed of was denied him, for he was met by the sight of a tent flying the Norwegian flag. Amundsen, Scott's great rival, had beaten him to the pole. It was a crushing blow.
The wind is blowing hard. Temperature is -21, and there is that curious, damp, cold feeling in the air which chills one to the bone in no time. Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority.
Amundsen's strategy had been very different from Scott's. Relying on his experience from the Arctic, he had foregone careful planning and made a dash for the pole. He had taken a gamble and won, beating Scott by a full 5 weeks.
Amundsen got to the pole first because of his transport arrangements. Very simple, a few men on skis with lots of dogs. He was able to take less time getting to the pole and back again, and he was able to eat the dogs as they travelled. He knew about travelling over snow and ice. He knew about the cold.
They had not been first, but Scott's men planted the British flag and then began the long journey home. Scott's preparations had served them well, and they believed they would quickly make it back to the safety of the coast, even though Edgar Evans was beginning to have problems with frostbite. Scott's confidence came from his careful planning and from his understanding of the weather data that meteorologist Simpson had provided him. In fact, Solomon found that Scott was counting on the weather to bring them home.
I had to really step back in time, because a critical part of putting the pieces of the puzzle together was